So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to everybody who's joining us in person and all those who are joining us on the live stream. My name is Malini Mhera. I'm Chief Executive of Globe Legislators and the host of the Parliamentary Pavilion here at COP29. So we're now on day 11, and amongst many themes for today, the theme is oceans. So we're delighted to have organized a very interactive session because Pippa, you and Rachel are the only two speakers who are going to be joining us here in person, and the remainder are going to be joining us from afar. They will explain where they're joining us from. So the theme for today, of course, is on the obligations under the Law of the Sea Convention, UNCLOS, model laws and frameworks and challenges to effective global governance. So this is the Parliamentary Pavilion, and the focus is very much on what parliamentarians can do to transcribe legal opinions which have been reached international framework legislation. To introduce the subject, I'm going to ask our colleague and good friend, Charlotte de Ruzica-Lachaussee, who is joining us from Charlotte. I'm not sure exactly where you are right now, somewhere in the South Pacific, quite possibly, but you tell us. And Charlotte has been instrumental in organizing this because she is a legislative attorney and has been working on these issues and is now with COSIS, which is the Commission of Small Island States. Charlotte, I'm going to give you the floor for the introduction. I hope the line is clear, and please do introduce yourself and COSIS for the benefit of everybody who is here. Please, go ahead. The floor is yours. The virtual floor. So while Charlotte is getting prepared, she probably is very well prepared, but while the line is connecting, I'm just going to introduce just by name, and I will invite you all to introduce yourselves in greater depth when you have the mic. So first of all, we have the Honourable Pippa Hayling, Member of Parliament. Pippa, are you a new intake? In the last elections, fantastic. So you are the parliamentary spokesperson for climate change for the Liberal Democrats in the UK. Yeah. And directly next to me is the Honourable Rachel Brooking, Member of Parliament from the New Zealand Parliament. And we have joining us online, we have Flaminia Tacconi, who is an EU fisheries lawyer from Bloom. We also have Professor Elisa Morguera, who is a UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights. We have David Kay and Hadrian Gu. And I'm going to invite all of you, please, to briefly introduce yourselves after we've had the introduction from Charlotte. And we can see you all beautifully now. I hope you can see us. Give a wave if you can. Fantastic. Thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, Charlotte, over to you, please. We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Fantastic, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you so much, Malini. Hello, everyone. Kaselelie, greetings to everyone who is joining us for this COP conversation. So I'm very honored and excited to be with you today, Ocean Day at COP29 for hybrid side event, co-hosted by COSIS and Globe at the Parliamentary Pavilion, which we have entitled Legislating for Ocean Conservation, that will discuss state obligations under the Law of the Sea Convention and other international law instruments, law and frameworks, and challenges to effective global ocean governance. So some of us are present at the pavilion, and I'm sorry, Malini, you may have said that already. I'm actually I was in the waiting room, and so I'm not sure what you've already said. So maybe I repeat.
No problem. Just start from the top.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, some of us are present at the pavilion, and others are following the live broadcast from the four corners of the globe. And our video recording will be available after the discussion so that you can revisit what was said and take notes and share it with your networks. So unfortunately, I had to cancel my participation in person after the public authorities advised French nationals not to attend the COP. So I have to attend online, but perhaps that's for the best because, as we know, getting to the COP generates a lot of emissions And as I live in the Pacific, it would take me 2 days to get there, which is very carbon intensive. So my name, Charlotte Rüttiger, I'm a lawyer and I serve the COSIS Secretariat, which I was privileged to help establish at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. And I must say here that although I facilitated the organization of this event for COSIS, my remarks reflect my own views and not those of the Commission. So first of all, I would like to thank our panelists who are legislators, researchers, lawyers, and policymakers with a wide range of knowledge and perspectives due to their position, which promises to generate very interesting discussion. I'd like to say a big thank you to Melini and Nemeka at Globe for their loyalty and support. I'm very grateful to them for always supporting the ideas I put to them, and I truly admire their energy and tireless work to give legislators their rightful place at the heart of climate negotiations. And as a former legislative attorney, I am firmly convinced that legislators play a key role in tackling the climate crisis, as they hold the ultimate power to legislate for change, at least in countries where the rule of law prevails. They are at the service of their constituents, and today we're witnessing a paradigmatic shift. Citizens are demanding concrete action on climate issues. This is a bottom-up movement, which means it's also a very powerful movement because it's gaining momentum, and the power of public opinion to steer policies in certain directions is enormous. So as lawyers, we talk about the power of international law, but in fact, the power of the name and shame effect is absolutely essential in international relations, and therefore in international climate negotiations, and should not be underestimated. So legislators are the recipients of citizens' demands, and if they're asked and if they're trained and well informed on these climate issues, notably through their participation in the Conference of Parties, they will take action, pass laws, and bring about change. That's why with COSIS, we chose the Parliamentary Pavilion for our COP-side event. The COP is the place to influence climate negotiations, to challenge the minds of climate thinkers and decision makers, and to get inspiration and good ideas from them. And parliamentarians have the real power to affect change through law, as I just said. And at COSIS, we believe that law is the solution, or at least part of it, along with science, data, education, technology, capacity building, finance. So we hope that what is discussed here, and here I put my COSIS hat, will not only inspire participants at this event, but that it will also enable citizens to understand what the court has said in this opinion I'm just going to talk about in a minute, what this may mean for people's respective climate projects and fights, and also how they can use this opinion to push their government to take ambitious action, including through legal action if necessary, and many other means. So for COSIS, that stands for Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law. It's an intergovernmental organization of 9 small island developing states in the Pacific and Caribbean who were tired of empty promises and lack of commitments in climate negotiations, and particularly at COPs, and decided to set up a commission to examine what international law had to say about climate change and how the law could be a tool for achieving better results. As part of its mandate, the Commission took the case to the United Nations Ocean Tribunal. The name is in fact International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, or ITLOS for the acronym. And this case is historic as it's the first climate change case to be brought before an international tribunal. Essentially, the Commission asked the tribunal whether greenhouse gas emissions constitute marine pollution and what binding obligations states have to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment and to protect and preserve the marine environment, in short, ocean, under that United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And in the context of climate change, because we're in that very specific context now, and in light of the findings of the best available science, which is the findings of the IPCC. So I'm going to ask Nemeka if he could play this short video that shows what the case is about, and it's about 5 minutes long.
Yesterday, we have signed an historic accord to establish a commission.
The commission was made operational yesterday, and it is actually designed to
change the conversation from one of vague voluntary commitments to legally binding obligations and compensation.
The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea is now in session. L'audience du Tribunal international du droit de la mer est ouverte.
At its third meeting on 26 August 2022, the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law decided to request an advisory opinion from the tribunal.
For almost 30 years, small island states have been arguing about the impact of climate change, and there's been little response. And that is what has actually forced us now to have this complementary pathway, this legal pathway, in order to accelerate the climate diplomacy that is taking place with these various COPs.
In my time, I've seen, beaches have started to disappear completely. I'm seeing that the coastline in Antigua looks different than it did when I was a kid, and that was only about 10 years ago. So give it 20 more years or 30 more years, what's gonna happen?
So I'm also a mother to a 1-year-old daughter of the Pacific. I'm hopeful that she will be able to return to her ancestral homeland and know that she still has a place there and that it still exists for her to enjoy. And at the same time, I'm worried that it may not be there anymore for her.
1982, UN recognized the Convention of the Law of the Sea and the importance of this trial so that people are aware of their obligations. Life is complicated and it involves difficult choices. We're all familiar with the propensity of governments to explain that their past promises cannot be fulfilled because of unforeseen developments or the need to balance competing demands or to pursue more urgent or important objectives. That is the nature of politics. But we are not politicians. The duty of the lawyer is to say, honestly and plainly, what the law is.
One of the main imperatives in their mandate is to address a fundamental inequity. And that fundamental inequity is that this group of specially affected countries, these small island states, contribute minimal levels of GHG emissions. They're contributing minuscule amounts to the problem, and yet they are experiencing the most cataclysmic, catastrophic, and even existential harm.
The world is in the middle of an unprecedented revolution, and that's the only way one can describe it. And that revolution is among the grassroots. It's from the bottom up. And those who have traditionally been on the margins of power are rising up, they're uniting, and they're making their voices heard.
We hope that this decision will be a landmark which other tribunals will follow, and so that the obligations, moral obligations, but increasingly legal obligations will follow from that too.
Either a unified humankind does what is necessary now to address climate change, or it will be forced to do so after unimaginable catastrophes leave no other choice.
So Charlotte, thank you very much. Are we ready to hear from Pippa and Rachel now? Or would you like to say something further with regard to the legal opinion? So that we've seen the video.
Yeah.
Please do. Please continue.
Yes.
Please do continue.
So if you want, I can quickly say what the tribunal said, unless actually the co-panelists want to do it. And then I just have that question framed for the audience. So what do you think?
I think it would be very helpful. So we've seen the video, and it's set up the challenge. It's set up the case that has been brought from COSIS to the tribunal. But if you can just summarize what the legal opinion was, because the format we're going to have now is that we're going to invite the two politicians to tell us about what the legal framework is in their own countries in terms of marine protection. And then we're going to move it to the experts to speak more about this particular issue. And then we're going to bring it to Alyssa, I think, towards the end, and she's going to be focusing on the challenges. So that would be the format for this afternoon's discussion. So if you can just briefly tell us what the legal opinion was, that would be an important backdrop to the presentation by the two members of Parliament.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. So that was in 2023, right, the hearings. And since then, the tribunal has delivered its opinion over 100 pages. And the tribunal said that the greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2, pollute the oceans through acidification, deoxygenation, warming of seawater, preventing the ocean from playing its crucial role as a carbon sink and climate regulator. So ocean is the solution, and we're destroying it. It's our carbon sink, and it's leading us to the catastrophe. So to put an end to that pollution of the marine environment, the state must mitigate their atmospheric emissions in order to prevent, reduce, and control that pollution. And this is an obligation for the states under the Law of the Sea Convention, which is this quite almost universal convention ratified by 168 states, known as the Ocean Constitution. So the tribunal said, well, you in fact have obligations. It's not optional, and we're clarifying what they are. So you have an obligation to take all necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control this marine pollution caused by GHG emissions. And that includes, and that's where it's very interesting in this pavilion, the adoption of national legislation and regulation. The establishment of a national system, including legislation, administrative procedures, and enforcement mechanism necessary to regulate the activities in question, to exercise adequate vigilance, to achieve the objective. And it's not all. The tribunal went very far, and it's a great victory because you cannot just pretend that you're making mitigation efforts. In other words, bad faith is not welcome in this day and age. So that's an interesting comment to make at a COP, because you have to go further. it's not up to the states and their goodwill to decide on the level of ambition. On the contrary, they have an obligation to be ambitious. They must follow certain objective standards, science, to determine the level of ambition, keeping this 1.5 degree as a northern star. Of course, I'm not using legal terminology here, and my colleagues will probably elaborate further with maybe more legal terms, but it's more important, I think, to really understand the idea why this decision is really important and must be known of the legislator. So the question we're asking legislators today is how they legislate to ensure that their legislation complies with these are kind of in line, I shouldn't say compliant, but in line with the findings of this advisory opinion. How do they legislate to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and thus avoid marine pollution? And we would like to initiate this dialogue, and I'm doing a little bit of your work, Malini. It's my last words here. So we want to initiate this dialogue with stakeholders to ask them about their national legislation and plans to reduce GHG emissions. We have, so as you said, members of Parliament, New Zealand, UK. What are the international proposals and initiatives aimed at reducing these GHG emissions? But we also have representatives from 2 non-profit organizations with brilliant ideas, Bloom in France and Opportunity Green in the UK, and both use the law as a tool for action and ambition. So I think their contribution will be very valuable. And finally, the UN Special Rapporteur on climate change, Professor Elisa Mogera, who I think will present her mission, hopefully. I would love to hear about it, mission work, but also discuss the challenges that ICLOS identified in the advisory opinion and how this may affect the legislature. So over to you.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to bring this completely up to date. Last week, Globe entered into a partnership with Client Earth. You'll be very familiar with the work of Client Earth. It's an organization that litigates in the interests of the planet, and with WWF International. And what we are very much focused on is how this next generation of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, can account for impacts and can also set their countries on an accelerated pathway to reducing emissions, but also to adapting to climate change. So that brings the current context very much in the frame, because if I can invite both Pippa and Rachel to come here. So we're having this discussion because not very many members of Parliament know about this particular hearing. We have in the past, at previous COPs, we've invited the Stop Ecocide Foundation to talk to us about the implications of their work for the legislative upgrading, so to speak. So you've received a summary from Charlotte. We're going to get into a little bit more detail. But we've invited you. You represent 2 parties out of 198 who are here at COP. But it would be very interesting for us to know from you what the current context is for marine protection in your own legal frameworks and possibly even in your own NDCs and your national climate change laws. So why don't we start with you, Pippa? Please, go ahead.
Good, thank you very much. So I'm Pippa Halings, and I'm Liberal Democrat spokesperson in Parliament for energy security and net zero. So healthy seas really are carbon sinks, as we've heard. So they regulate climate, they reduce climate impacts, but they're also hugely impacted by greenhouse gas emissions, as we've seen too. So that carbon sink becomes threatened. So in the UK, I'm going to talk to you about what we've done legislatively in terms of increasing our ambitions and what we've succeeded in doing and where we have some challenges. But from the outset, I can say none of this has been laid out in terms of the advisory that we've just had from ICLOS, in terms of this being to ensure that we reduce marine pollution. So that's something that I also want to bring in at the end, because we're looking at introducing new legislation in the UK which I'll talk about at the very end, which is the Climate and Nature Act, where we could potentially incorporate the results of this new advisory, that we need to look at marine pollution as well in terms of our obligations beyond the Paris Agreement, because it potentially needs to include sectors such as aviation and shipping, which currently are not required within our legislation or our NDCs. So that takes our ambition further. So UK has made significant advances. We were the first country in 2008 to have legislation dedicated climate change legislation. 2008, the Climate Change Act, which established not only that we need to also have our binding targets, which are in line with net zero by 2050, but also that we have an independent National Committee for Climate Change, which both sets out what the carbon budgets are according to our ambition for 2050, and evaluates progress and recommends to the government for each NDC what we need to do in able to ratchet up the ambition to reach those. So what we can say is the UK has been the first country, one, to have that legislation, two, to close as an industrialised nation, to be the first to have closed its last coal-fired power station. So that is huge. That's really, really good. And also, in its NDC, when it presented it before the latest one, it had its 2035 targets in line with net zero. It was the first country to have them in line with net zero as well. And what we can say is that the first 3 carbon budgets up until 2022 have been achieved. And that's through successive governments. So what we've seen is by having legislation and a cross-party political consensus around that legislation has weathered a lot, including differences, in changes of government and ideologies and difficult financial contexts as well. So that has been very good. Why we've been able to achieve that ahead of this was decarbonisation of electricity, particularly, and looking at buildings as well. However, and this was alluded to by, I thought was very interesting in the video that we saw around the court. Politicians alleged to also take into account the social context, other pressures, and what we had with the previous Conservative government was a breaking of that political consensus, a rowing back on some of the policies, which has meant that now, even though we had 2023 record reduction in emissions in line with our carbon budget, those policies being removed means that we are now way off track for meeting our carbon targets. We are off track. And that means we need to ratchet up the ambition. We've had a change of government. And what I'm happy to say is that's put us back. The legislation meant they couldn't go too far away. That's really important to see. But it meant that it had some holding there, even though we were pulling back. So we are now, with a new government, happy to see that we are putting this back on track. We are increasing our ambitions. The NDC, presented as the only 2 countries, UK and Brazil, coming to COP29, increased from 65%, 68%, to 81% by 2035 to try and catch up. So that means in the midterm, we've got to catch up very, very fast. And that's looking particularly, again, at energy. So it was the renewables and the pulling back on offshore, onshore wind in particular. That's now massively being stimulated by the new government and the creation of a new legislation called Great British Energy. Offshore wind. So we've now got to look at both climate and nature. Offshore wind, floating offshore platforms, the seabed, what's happening with those coastal and marine waters. We've got to make sure that's done in an environmentally sustainable way. There are tensions there, so that's really important to make sure that we're looking at what the duty to nature and our Environment Act is as we race forwards in terms of that acceleration. However, shipping and aviation haven't been included. Now, in terms of shipping, which is one of the most pollutant, that's been regulated under other agreements like the IMO. Now, the UK has looked at and promoted things like sulfur pollution reduction, was one of the, really pushed for that to happen earlier than 2025 by 2020. And it's also looking at having decarbonisation of shipping with a new investment that came in a couple of years ago. However, that isn't in our NDC. Our NDC, newly presented today, has nothing about aviation and shipping, and the National Committee on Climate Change says we will struggle to really meet our targets if we don't also ratchet up ambitions within those. So what do we need to do now? We are bringing forward in January, as the Liberal Democrats, a new legislation called the Climate and Nature Bill. And this is one where we look at both our climate obligations alongside our nature obligations. We have to report on both by government, and we bring in, as was mentioned here, citizen assemblies. So we'd have climate and nature citizens assemblies. And it says we have to go beyond the Paris Agreement because we have an obligation to look at the pollution that is happening across all of biodiversity in order to really meet that. Now, in terms of our marine resilience, it's really low. So when we're looking at, we've missed all of our nature targets in terms of our 30 by 30 biodiversity target, which would enable our oceans and seas and coasts to have some kind of resilience and to enable it to continue to be a sink. It was only in 2023 that we established our first highly protected MPAs. Only 3, only 8%. But before that, we've got marine coastal zones, highly compromised, bottom trawling, all sorts of things. So we've got to get our act together on that. I see a huge opportunity with the Climate and Nature Act to bring these together.
So thank you very much, Pippa. Shipping and aviation have been discussed here in COP. As you've rightly identified, that's the next frontier. You've identified rightly not just the legislative gaps which exist, not addressing marine issues, protection for marine areas, but what you're proposing to do to fill those gaps. So I'm going to turn to you now, Rachel. You're both island nations, of course, bearing that in mind. So you have a vested interest in ensuring that your coasts and the marine environment you are nestled in is a clean and healthy one. So from a New Zealand perspective, where are the gaps? Let's just focus on those and what you propose to fill them, because we have 4 other speakers who are going to propose their own suggestions for filling in those gaps. Over to you.
Well, can I, you can hear me? Yep, thanks. Well, kia ora koutou. I'll be slightly naughty though, and I just want to say a couple of things about what Pippa was saying to get to where maybe the gaps are. So I'm a Labour Party MP in New Zealand, so that means I'm in opposition, not speaking for the government at all here, but we were in government for 6 years until about a year ago. Now, New Zealand basically through Globe, in part through Globe, had really strong bipartisan working group of people a couple of parliaments ago, and they went to the UK and stole the UK approach. So that's...
Imitation is the best form of flattery. So, well, we know it's the gold standard, yes.
So I won't go into that in too much detail, apart from, of course, we have a climate commission. Very important that it's independent of Parliament, and they do what you were talking about with your committee. We also have an emissions reduction plan, and that goes into the various ways that we can meet our targets. Also in that 30 by 30, signed up to that as well. Get there on the land really easily, but not in the marine environment. We've just done some work to have some more marine protected areas, but failed big time in terms of some ambition to get to the 30% in the marine environment with one area, the Kermadix area. That didn't work, and we do, so in terms of gaps, we do need to look at our marine protection legislation so that it can work with Indigenous people who also have fisheries rights. That was the difficulty to get that across the line. So that is a big gap. We need to do a whole lot more work there. I'm an opposition MP, so I would say that the new government has come in and is not doing all that we would want them to be doing in terms of mitigation generally, but is still very much signed up to the same targets under the legislation that we stole from the UK. So in terms of general pollution into the marine environment, obviously New Zealand's signed up to the various international agreements, and we have a lot of laws about what can go from land and be discharged into oceans. But we do have a major problem in New Zealand with what happens on the land, the sedimentation causing issues in our marine environment. And then we also have a lot of bottom trawling fisheries. 68% of New Zealand fisheries comes from bottom trawling. But probably the greatest environmental impact is the seamounts, which have a lot of coral on them, and when they get bottom trawled, that's an obvious area that we should be stopping any new areas being bottom trawled for that as well. So that's some gaps for you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for laying it out so clearly. The challenges from where you see it as national politicians. I'm now going to bring in Flaminia. Flaminia, I have a question for you, but I'd like you to use this as an opportunity to introduce yourself and your work. So you're from Bloom. This is a French organization, and you focus much of your work on the fishing industry. So Rachel had mentioned the importance of fishing as a livelihood for many communities. And you also mentioned bottom trawling, Rachel, and that's something that we know is an activity that generates a lot of carbon emissions. Could you please explain the impact of these emissions on fisheries in greater detail for us? We also see fossil fuel subsidies in France, across other members of the European Union. Could you give some details on how these harmful subsidies can be removed and what role you see for legislation in that? And just bear in mind, everybody, we have to be a bit more disciplined in terms of time, so either speak very quickly or keep your interventions to 5-6 minutes, no more. Thank you. Flaminia, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me with you. So yes, I work for Bloom. Bloom is a French NGO, and we work at national and EU level on the protection of the ocean, elimination of destructive fishing, and protecting of small-scale fishers. And I recently joined Bloom as a senior campaigner on the elimination of harmful subsidies in fisheries in general. So we have seen what the last report of the state of the climate came up with. Now we are at the brink of an irreversible climate disaster, and we all know that the ocean is our best ally in fighting climate change. So it absorbs more or less 30% of emissions. It is an essential carbon sink, as it has been said. The seabed stores almost 10 years of global emission in the first 5 centimeters. And this is, I think, very relevant in terms of emission in fishing. Fishing has been recognized as the most impactful human activity in the IPBES report, because most of the fishing that is happening is done at industrial scale using destructive fishing practices. So basically, it is literally a bulldozer scrapping away all forms of life from the seabed. And bottom trawling is also one of the fishing practices that releases the most CO2. So we're talking about 370 million tons in the atmosphere every year. What is very specific about fishing is that emissions do not only come from burning fossil fuel, and we know that they have increased compared to last year. So the EU fishery sector alone produced 7 million tons of CO2 per year just by burning fuel at sea. It excludes processing, transport, cooling, and also this indirect production of CO2 coming from the seabed scrapping. There are scientific research. We know that there is a release coming from this destructive fishing practice. We don't know to which amount. In addition of that, we know that not only the ocean, like the water and the seabed is a sink, but all marine life basically is a carbon sink because of the way biologically they operate. So by fishing in a very destructive but also unselective way, and also the scale of fishing has a huge impact on the ability of the ocean to play its role as a climate regulator and carbon sink, but also in its ability to absorb the CO2, but also in its ability to preserve marine life and marine ecosystem that are vital to these functions. It is surprising, that all life on Earth stems from the ocean, and that it's still so vital to our survival. So we need to stop the destruction of the ocean, not only by reducing the emission that we emit, by reducing the destructive fishing practice, but also we need to stop this destruction, which is basically financed by us. So for the last 30 years, despite repetitive calls of scientists and evidence of depletion of the stocks worldwide, big fishing nations still subsidize heavily industrial fishing. And in the EU, industrial fishing receives 80% of public money available, while they represent only 20% of EU fishers. So the kind of industrial fishing we're talking about, and maybe you have seen it in the news, is like the Annelies Ilena, which is a 140 meters long fishing vessel that fishes huge amount of fishing daily all over the world. And we cannot afford this anymore. How do we work on subsidies? So one example, so maybe I go back to the subsidies. Why are these a problem? Is because subsidies have been studied for decades at global, national, EU level. We all know that subsidies like fossil fuel subsidies reduce the cost of fishing and artificially increase the capacity of fishing vessels to fish, which means that we go into an overfishing loop. And in addition, we make this fishing dependent from subsidies. So we lead them artificially to more fishing, also more fuel, because one of the subsidies that we get is fossil fuel subsidies. At the moment, there is an EU legislation called Energy Taxation Directive that obliges member states to apply a tax exemption on fuel used for fishing. So it means that fishers do not pay the taxes on the fuel. And in France, only fuel tax exemption accounted to 206 million, representing 63% of total estimated subsidies. And this goes to the more polluting industrial fishing fleet. I'm
going to come in on this. Sorry. In the interest of time, I'm going to come in on this because you've laid out the problem very well. There has been a lot of attention to perverse subsidies, not just at this COP, but at previous COPs. So I'd like to know now what you're doing to address that through litigation. I'm going to come to Hadrian, to you, please, for describing your work on that. And then briefly, I'm going to come quickly to you, David, just so that we can actually get everybody's views in. And then we can have Alyssa's, her closing remarks on this before we have, hopefully, a couple of minutes' time for the politician's response. So, Hadrian, over to you, please.
Yeah, I understand the constraint of time. I'll try to be very brief. My name is Adrien Goux. I also work at Bloom. I'm from France, and I'm managing the fossil fuel campaign at Bloom, which is like 2 years old, and we mainly focus on climate litigation against Total Energy. So what we did 6 months ago was a criminal complaint targeting Total Energy, their executives and their main shareholders, for the contribution to climate change. We did that with 8 plaintiffs, all victims of climate change extreme events from all over the world. And what we tried to target for Total was so criminal law, involuntary manslaughter, reckless endangerment, etc. But because their contribution of climate change, meaning they knew in the past, they represent, they are among top 20 worst emitters of the planet, historic emitters, I mean. And worst is that they still continue to open new fossil fuel projects. Since COP28, when we agreed internationally on the fossil fuel phase out, Total Energy announced 21 new investment in fossil fuel projects. And that has to be linked with BP and Shell, who has already also backed drove back from their climate pledges. So that is really meaning we need a binding agreement on non-proliferation and fossil fuels. I'll try to be very brief on the numbers, but I think it's important to mention that the IPCC in its 6th assessment report, the VG3, said that if we want to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees, we have 90% of our oil coal reserves, that cannot be burnt. We have 30% of our oil reserves that cannot be burnt, and 50% of the gas reserves that cannot be burnt. That is really huge. Another way to see it is a study from Ashekul Vizut, who told it another way, but mainly it's around 90% of coal. We need to have a decrease in supply of coal by 90%, 60% for oil, 40% for gas. But that is way more if we constrain the calculus to CDR, carbon dioxide removal development close to the consensus and the reality. And finally, another way to see it, but who is really like simpler than this, is that no new fossil fuel project should be approved. And that was a conclusion done by the International Energy Agency in 2021. So the level of legislation, whether it's national or international, should definitely like have as a standard this level of science, which is the most relevant, which is the most actual level of science. In order to do that, what we are pushing at Bloom and at so many other associations around the world, and I'll finish really right here, is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, meaning something which is binding, which is also targeting the private sector. That is a conclusion from the advisory opinion of the ITLOS mentioned earlier. The states should also regulate private sector. For instance, in the UK, there should definitely be legislation for BP and Shell, which are now in the UK. In France, it's for Total Energy. In the US, it's for the US carbon majors, etc., etc. And I'll really finish here, but this fossil fuel non-proliferation, it should be discussed already during COPs, because if not, you see that at Bloom we did this criminal complaint against Total, but there are definitely so many climate victims, associations, and even states considering climate litigation in criminal law, especially to target those biggest emitters that are still pursuing the fossil fuel expansion, even though they know that it means island going below the sea level and people dying from climate change extreme events.
Thank you very much. So, Hadrian, thank you very much for laying down your strategy, which is a combination of litigation, as well as efforts such as the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. There is a parliamentary forum. We have hosted many of their events here at the Parliamentary Pavilion, both this year as well as in previous years. I'm going to turn to you now, David, from Opportunity Green, please. I'd like to ask you to lay out the implications of the ITLOS advisory opinion on international maritime and aviation industries.
Thank you very much, Melanie and Charlotte, and thank you to COSIS and Globe for organising today and inviting me along. I'm a lawyer at Opportunity Green. We're an NGO that works to close the gaps in global climate action, and we submitted a written statement to the ITLOS advisory proceedings last year. So very briefly, to set the theme for international shipping and aviation, in terms of current policies and action, it's estimated that the international shipping sector is on course for somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees of warming, and in the aviation sector, policies and action are consistent with warming of over 4 degrees. So coming back to Charlotte's description of the general obligation, which is critical here under UNCLOS, so the obligation to take all necessary measures to prevent, reduce and control greenhouse gas emissions from any source, both sectors clearly fall squarely within that general obligation. The obligation carries an exacting standard. Those measures have to be determined objectively. They're not nationally determined like under Paris. They also need to take into account the best available science and a 1.5 degree pathway. The tribunal, interestingly, also said that they cannot be discharged exclusively through participating in global efforts. States need to take domestic action, which brings us on to the subject of today, which is why it's so important for legislators. To date, generally, states have deferred to the UN agencies, so the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, and the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, when it comes to these sectors. But the measures under both, to the extent there are measures, fall significantly short of alignment with 1.5 degrees. So what implications does that have for states and for legislators? Well, it means that their obligations under UNCLOS remain unsatisfied insofar as ICAO and IMO measures remain insufficient and they haven't taken any domestic action. So conscious of time, I'll come very briefly on to 3 things states could do. Firstly, they could include emissions from international aviation and shipping in national carbon budgets and targets, and we're already seeing some positive movement here. Switzerland have done that, the UK is doing that. The Climate Change Commission that Rachel mentioned in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is currently consulting on that. They should include them in NDCs. They should they should do that anyway under Paris. It's an economy-wide obligation. And the third generation of those are due in February 2025. The importance of bringing them into NDCs, though, really is that they brought into the scope of domestic climate action, and they don't fall through a kind of regulatory gap that we create. So the key point here is that for legislators to take away is the need to introduce domestic regulation for both of these sectors if we're going to see proper climate action in both of them. And that goes to Pippa's comment right at the beginning of today's session about the importance of having that legislation in the first place to guide action. And very briefly, I'm a lawyer, I'm no policy expert, but there are clear policy interventions that can be made, and there's some working examples already. So in terms of carbon pricing, the EU shows us emissions trading systems can apply internationally. So shipping covers all intra-EU voyages and half of emissions between EU and non-EU ports. Aviation covers all intra-EU, departing flights to Switzerland and the UK, and the EU is going to look at including international flights in that in 2 years' time. The Turkish Parliament voted this year to include shipping emissions in its developing ETS, and there's suggestions that China may expand its domestic ETS to include international shipping as well. Taxation and levies, both sectors are incredibly undertaxed. There's important pricing signals to that and externalization questions, but it also helps close the price gap with sustainable forms of transport and fuels. And levies as well, and there's an opportunity to link there to the climate finance requirements of states, and notably the Global Levy Solidarity Task Force is looking at both sectors in this regard. It's not an exhaustive list, there's lots more. There's fuel mandates, again, the EU and UK have shown how that can be done in aviation, and the EU in shipping, and policy experts will no doubt add more things that could be done, airport caps, etc. But I think the key takeaway for me here is that there's an opportunity here for legislators to both meet their climate mitigation obligations under UNCLOS, but also their climate finance commitments if they use those policy interventions in a joined up way to both decarbonize the sectors and also use revenues generated to support climate vulnerable countries.
Thank you very much, David. It's very helpful to have that set of that portfolio of potential policy measures in addition to the implications that you've laid out for national existing nationally determined contributions, national climate plans. So I'd like to quickly come now to Alyssa. Alyssa, first of all, if you can please describe your role for us. And then if you can explain what the challenges there are, the potential contradictions or complementarities between this tribunal ruling, which has come from a particular legislation, the UN Law of the Sea, and its implications for the Paris Agreement. Go ahead, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much. And first of all, apologies for keeping my camera closed, but I've come back from Baku with a heavy cold. So as UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, I'm an independent expert that I'm supported by the UN Human Rights Office, but I'm independent from the UN as well as everyone else. And my role is to clarify international obligations of states to protect human rights in the context of climate change, including protect human rights from certain negative impacts of certain climate response measures, and also clarify the responsibilities of business to respect human rights in the context of their own activities and whether they are contributing to climate change or taking action to respond to climate change. And what I've done in my first two reports, which one was a synthesis of all the guidance already developed by several UN human rights experts on climate change and human rights, and the second on access to information on climate change and human rights, is really to clarify how the ITLOS advisory opinion, which only mentions human rights concerns but doesn't quite spell out its relevance for human rights, is really essential. So complying with that guidance from ITLOS is essential to ensure protection of everyone's human right in the context of climate change, and particularly the human rights of those who are already most affected and for the longest time by climate change. And they also mean that in applying that advisory opinion, we need to apply relevant international human rights standards in terms of participation, access to information, and protection of the most vulnerable. And this is really, I think, a very helpful process for parliamentarians as well as others to ensure policy coherence and to maximize actions that can fulfill multiple public policy objectives. Because in fact, wherever we see climate action not being sufficient or negatively impacting on biodiversity or on the ocean, that's when we see negative human rights impacts. And in fact, that's where we identify ineffective climate action. So with that background, I'll just share, I think, 6 very quick messages around how the advisory opinion provides both challenges, but also really highlights the crucial role of parliamentarians in advancing effective and fair climate action to the benefit of all. So the first is the question of how to implement in national legislation that requirement of strict due diligence to prevent, reduce, and control greenhouse gas emissions from any source to prevent marine pollution. And what the advisory opinion shows is that we need to look at multiple areas of international law and, of course, multiple areas of national law. We really need to look at whether our nature legislation, our law of the sea legislation, but also our relevant pieces on human rights are all aligned and interoperable, or whether there are tensions, gaps, or even contradictions. And I think this is a critical role for parliamentarians to do in revising and maybe reforming, as well as developing new pieces of legislation. The second is the importance of applying human rights standards, and we should keep in mind that unfortunately we're lagging a bit behind in understanding how our human rights are dependent on a healthy ocean. But the science is catching up and the law is catching up as well. And I think in that regard, there's both the procedural aspect, how important access to information is to really bring together all these intersected elements of a healthy environment and a safe climate, and clarify how they impact on different human rights, keeping in mind that, again, we have differentiated human rights impacts. Children, older people, persons with disabilities, and many others are more impacted by climate change than others. And we have enough evidence from a scientific, health evidence perspective, as well as in terms of international standards, to really make sure that when we have participatory processes, which we should in reviewing national legislation, such as citizens' assembly, we need to ensure that really informed and as transparent as participatory approach as possible, ensuring representation of those human rights holders who are most affected. Because in fact, their lived experiences can really provide the insights to understand where we need to take action and where maybe national laws are either falling short or not quite well connected with one another. The other 2 quick points, I think, to transpose in legislation or ensure are well respected in national legislation is the role of environmental impact assessments. ITLOS really clarified how those assessments need to take into account the broad understanding of emissions of greenhouse gases and their impacts from all sources, but they also need to include socioeconomic impacts from a precautionary and ecosystem-based approach. And that's where human rights impacts come into play, and really understanding who's going to be affected by a proposed activity, and have we really thought through whether those potential impacts may be human rights violations. And I think, again, just to emphasize that point, whenever we may have climate measures or activities that may negatively impact on climate and also have foreseeable negative impacts on human rights, we're going down a path that's not going to help with climate change and many other public policy objectives. And the final point is about, very quickly, technology. So ITLOS also spoke about the legal obligations not to use technologies for climate mitigation, such as geoengineering, but I would say there may be others that may either transform pollution from one type into another, be incompatible with state obligations to control technology, and I've added in my reports technologies that may negatively impact on marine biodiversity, which itself contributes to climate regulation. And this may be, I think, a big gap in national laws in many countries. So thanks so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, for sharing so succinctly the results of your 2 reports and your 6 recommendations. I think they've been well noted. I'm going to, in the interest of time, because we have hit the hour, I'm just going to take a few minutes to invite both politicians to reflect on what they have heard. Be as pithy as you can. This is really about what you're going to do when you go back to your chambers in Parliament.
on the subsidies point, New Zealand hates subsidies for both fisheries and fossil fuels, and really anything else as well. So it's been across parliaments committed to opposing subsidies and working hard on those issues at the international level. I didn't say at the start that New Zealand has a very strange emissions profile in terms of about 50% of emissions come from agriculture, which is unusual. But in terms of going back to the gaps, I take David's point when he referenced the Climate Commission around making recommendations for those marine and air emissions. So I'll go back and continue on promoting what the Climate Commission has said. Also, Eliza just mentioned there, when you're making decisions about whether or not something should go ahead, what the climate consequences are of that. That's something that's bounced in and out of our legislation in New Zealand. So again, we'll do some more work on that. And I want to finally conclude with saying how important the Pacific is to New Zealand, and always has been and always will be. So on that human rights point, they're very obvious. If you've got nowhere to live with the impacts of climate change, that's a very real and present and tangible thing that New Zealanders can understand. And so I will continue to use that as a motivation to do as much as we possibly can to reduce our climate emissions.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. And Pippa, over to you.
Yes, I'd just like to add something additional, I think, which is we have the legislation, but what we've seen successively now from the last government and including now with this current government is we only have plans to actually deliver a third of what is in the NDC. So you can have the legislation, you can have an ambitious NDC, but if you don't actually have the plans for delivering it, then we've got a problem. And that's what the Committee on Climate Change is flagging seriously. So if we're going to incorporate our shipping and aviation, we've just got to make sure that we don't just do this in name alone, that it's within the target, that therefore we have to make sure we've got those delivery plans for it. Also, in terms of human rights, we had also from the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, we've had concerns in terms of the tightening of legislation in the UK in locking up environmental defenders, those who are campaigning for increased climate action. In my constituency, I have somebody who is now in jail for 5 years for having conspired, being part of a Zoom meeting to plan a public protest. So this is concerning. What we want to do is a review of that legislation. To me, that's quite shocking that that happens within the UK. So that's something under the Public Offences and Nuisance Act. They were not allowed to bring climate change into the courtroom. It was ruled by the judges inadmissible evidence. So I think we've got to work on multiple fronts, but I think those are two key areas.
No, that is indeed the challenge. Alyssa, you laid that out really well in that we've got this intersection of various different traditions of law. We've got human rights, we've got the commitments under the Paris Agreement, we've got UNCLOS, but of course this is also the triple COP here, which makes it all the more complex for lawmakers because they've got to be attuned to what's coming out of Cali, what's coming out of Baku, and then what will come out of Riyadh, and what that means in terms of coherence. Coherence for legal frameworks, coherence for policies. Pippa's mentioned the absence of sufficient policies in the UK context, and finally the resourcing, the funding. So it's not easy to navigate, but I'm really pleased that we were able to organize this session where we've educated more people in the room now and those who are able to join us online, but also we have this recording which is available for all of us to be able to inform a larger group of potential supporters. I would just like to add on one final point, and that is about the presidency here. So you may or may not know it, but the presidency, the COP29 presidency, has highlighted the SIDS, the Small Island Development States, as their key states of concern. So there's an open door to push at, to ensure that some of the recommendations that have been made in terms of ensuring that aviation and maritime emissions are considered as part of the new whole of economy, NDCs 3.0, are taken into account. So, as I said, the door is open. We're very willing and ready to do our part from Globe to mobilize the parliamentary constituency on this. But I would like to thank all of those on the stage, both of those on the stage, all of those who are joining us online, thank you very much to all of our speakers, everybody in the room, and those who've joined us online for this session today. Thank you very much.